Okay, so good morning and thanks for joining us this morning at Housing California. We are here today to talk about financing modular housing and exploring some challenges and innovation in the finance ecosystem. So thanks for being here. We look forward to hearing your questions later today or later this morning in the panel. I want to just quickly run through our outline for the day. We're going to do some introductions with our panelists. We'll jump into the panelist presentation. I will, as the moderator, ask some questions to our panelists and then turn it over to the audience for Q&A. My name is Alex Dawson. I'm a senior program officer with the Local Initiative Support Corporation based out of our Los Angeles office. And at LISC, my work oversees our housing initiatives, so anything from lending to technical assistance. And I'm going to pass it over to our panelists, starting with Brendan to make introductions.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everybody. I'm Brendan O'Donnell, Associate Vice President of Development with Abode Communities. Abode Communities is a nonprofit developer, owner, property manager, service provider, and even architect for affordable housing and supportive housing, primarily focused and based in Los Angeles, but also increasingly more throughout California. Chris, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, Chris Hubbard. I'm the Officer for Program-Related Investments at the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. I've been here about 2 years, but before that, I was at a different foundation working on some of the same stuff. I do a lot of loans to nonprofit organizations, and that's across multiple program areas of the foundation. But for the homelessness program, it focuses on Los Angeles County. So that's what I'm here to talk about today, and I'll pass it over to James.
Thanks, Chris. James Vasugi, excited to be here. Always excited to talk about affordable housing, but especially excited today to talk about modular. But I don't think I need to explain what Chase is, but we have a very large community development banking group that does all sorts of construction, permanent debt financing for all sorts of innovative communities all around California and the West Coast and across the country, really. But me and myself, I'm based in the Bay Area and work with clients all over California. So I'll pass it over back to you, Alex.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everybody, for being here and sharing your expertise today with the field. We're very excited for this conversation. So in today's session, we're going to explore the financing ecosystem for factory-built housing, and in particular, explore innovations in the field of finance. What are the challenges faced by modular projects when it comes to attracting conventional financing sources? And do the right products exist in the market for scaling modular housing? You're going to hear from our participants who are going to talk about the various roles that they've played in financing modular housing and about challenges and successes around innovations being tested in the lending space. So we're going to start today with a quick two-question poll. The first question is, have you used modular construction in an affordable housing project? So keep it open for 10 more seconds or so, but we're almost kind of 50-50. We've got about, let's see, I can end the poll. We've got about, oh wait, we're moving further away from 50-50. About 43% of you have used modular construction in the past. 57% have not. Okay, very interesting. I think I can share the results. You guys see those? Okay. And then our second question, let's see. Do I do this? I'm sorry. Here we go. Okay. Do you plan to use modular construction in an affordable housing project in the near future? Ooh, lots of yeses so far. All right, so it looks like we've got an overwhelming yes. 73% of folks plan to use modular housing in the near future. 27% said no. It'd be interesting to dig into the why on the yeses and why on the nos, but that's maybe for a future session. Thank you for answering our questions. It's good to understand kind of the experience and the potential trajectory in the room. Oops. So why are we here talking about modular? Why is it important? Of course, I think we all in this session and at this conference and in our industry understand California's dire lack of affordable housing and the real crisis that we're in. Construction costs are rising. And I won't spend a lot of time going through stats on, on our current crisis in the situation, but the US housing shortage, rising construction costs in California and nationwide, and the emphasis on innovation, especially in our Southern California region and across the state, really act as drivers of demand for the use of modular construction. And along with that demand is highlighting the importance of improving availability of finance for modular projects. We need to be tackling affordable housing development from multiple angles. And I think that's why modular is important. Whether or not it delivers on the promise of lower cost and speed is, I think, yet to be determined. But the promise of efficiencies in time and cost is something that we need to explore given where we're at in California. So to sort of frame out some of the major hurdles that we've heard about in financing modular construction and what we're going to dig into today, some really recent research findings emerging from the United Way's investment in accelerating permanent supportive housing in Los Angeles are showing that modular factories require large and sometimes up to 50% of a modular contract price deposit prior to construction closing in order to procure materials and reserve a spot in the factory's production schedule. This can be a burden to the developer in figuring out how are they going to pay for that large deposit that can sometimes range, well up to a few $1 million. The traditional construction draw schedule conflicts with the off-site construction process, where payment is typically made monthly after completion and inspection, right? Often there's a smaller pool of construction lenders that are willing to do modular projects because of the apparent risk in this upfront funding model. And similarly, some public funders have been unwilling to advance funds to cover the modular deposits. So as I mentioned in the last slide, the traditional construction draw schedule where funds are dispersed based on completion benchmarks really clash with the offsite construction process, where milestones are hard to gauge and don't necessarily translate into collateral or some sort of lien position for a lender. Additionally, depending on, like I said, depending on the size of the deal, the modular deposit can be huge. So I think we've come to understand some of these major financing hurdles at the beginning of a project. And then additionally, as you kind of get into the construction stages, modular assembly for multiple projects can lead to uncertainty in identifying collateral to secure a loan. So solutions, I'm not going to say I have solved this puzzle for everybody or that our panelists today have, but we're going to dive into some of the innovations in the field that we've been exploring to address some of these common financing challenges. So I'm going to turn it over to Brendan to talk about the collaborative that they've been working on for the last few years.
Thanks again, Alex, and thank you all for being here. It's nice to be able to talk about these things, even if just virtually. And it seems like a lot of you, whether you've explored it in practice or not, I'm sure almost everyone here has thought about modular. So we're really looking forward to a productive discussion and lots of questions that we may or may not be able to answer later on. But a little bit of background on the work that Abode Communities has been doing and kind of how we began our foray into modular. So this collective here that you see on screen, Abode Communities alongside our partners at Mercy Housing and LA Family Housing, as well as in collaboration with Factory OS, a modular fabricator based in Vallejo, with support from California Community Foundation. The 5 of us partnered in response to an RFP that was issued by the LA Mayor's Office back in 2019, with the very simple request that we develop supportive housing faster and cheaper. So no big deal, right? And so one of the things that we kind of quickly gravitated to was like, well, modular is kind of been out there in concept for a long time. Let's take a crack at it. Let's see if we can really try to work through a lot of the commonly known, maybe less commonly known challenges, and see if through a collection of multiple projects and bringing together all of our combined expertise, we can make modular work in a supportive housing context. And so we proposed over the course of 5 different projects, and originally about 360 units. Now we're up to, I think, close to 400 proposed units to attempt to work through these challenges in modular. And so one of those challenges, not the entirety of the problem, but one of those challenges that we're here to talk about today is the financing piece that Alex kind of framed out for us. So Alex, we can go to the next slide. And so really it was thinking about, okay, you know, you've got almost the entirety of the cost of modular. We're gonna have to find a way to pay for that before we can take advantage of any of our other construction period funds. The working assumption was that any of our lenders wouldn't be able to provide funds for anything until it was actually delivered on site. And so that was going to equate to basically 95% of the cost of the modules themselves, having to come up with those funds. And so part of our proposal in response to that RFP was using some of the HHH funds that were being offered in that RFP to start what we were calling a revolving construction loan fund, which in 2 years since proposing it, we've still yet to come up with a better name for it, but to this day, it just remains the RCLF. So we need some branding on that if anybody wants to help out. But essentially using those funds to kind of help catalyze other investment from, you know, foundations or private partners or whoever it may be, because we were looking at a pretty substantial chunk of funds that we would need to cover those costs. So roughly $20 million, I think is what we had evaluated for our close to 400 units. So pretty sizable for a group of nonprofit developers who don't just have that cash lying around. But one of the really great and just fortuitous things that happened along the way was that it became clear over time that certain construction lenders were becoming more comfortable with the modular process and addressing some of those unique challenges in timing along the way. And so as we were going out and starting to look at this big lift of raising a bunch of funds to help augment the HHH funds that were committed with it, we recognized that actually some lenders were going to be willing to pay for all of the deposits that occurred post-construction closing. So that essentially took us from about 95% of the module cost down to 25% of the module cost. So that was a major development and really can't take any credit for that. I will let some of my other particular panelists here take the credit for that. But it was a big help in us kind of achieving our goals. So Alex, if you go to the next slide, we can kind of break that down in detail, what that looks like a little bit more. This is reflective of what we were looking at when we initially proposed back in 2019, where you can see the breakdown of kind of roughly the different costs and the different timing associated with modular. And so in the case of what they're expecting was 25% of the module value kind of in the lead up to actually starting construction. And that's to kind of help hold your place on the assembly line, but also then start procuring materials for the work to start once you close on your construction financing. And then there's an additional 70% of the work that starts basically right when you're ready to move forward with the construction of the units. But again, that's happening off-site. And so our assumption was that we wouldn't be able to pay for those with our conventional construction financing until they were delivered to site. So that's how we came to the roughly 95% calculation and the gap that we were looking at. But Alex, if you go to the next slide, kind of shows how that calculus changed entirely, when now we're just looking at those pre-construction closing deposits. So it comes down to 25%. These hard numbers here, obviously kind of pre-COVID escalation, so it's a little bit more than that now, but sort of just representative of what it might be for a 64 unit project. And so again, it was a big change in our approach, but allowed us to then kind of work more specifically with just our foundation partners that we'd already started talking about, and then actually using those HH8 funds elsewhere for just permanent and construction financing dollars, which obviously we need a never-ending supply of. So it's a good way to repurpose those for something other than the RCLF. So I think we can go to the next slide, Alex. And here's just a quick summary of the 5 projects that we landed on as part of this initiative. And so 2 are being developed by my team at Abode Communities, 2 are being developed by LA Family Housing, and then 1 is being worked on by Mercy Housing. And Mercy Housing has actually done or is in the process of working on a few in the Bay Area as well. So they have quite a bit of experience with modular. And so again, you can see it's almost 400 units. All of these units are supportive housing units, serving people at or below 30% of the area median income. Next slide. And this particular project, Beacon Landing, this is the first of the 5 to really start construction. And so we actually just closed construction financing on this project in February of this year, so just a couple months ago. This is an 89 unit supportive housing project in the San Pedro neighborhood of Los Angeles. It was financed through HHH, typical construction funding, as well as county no place like home funds, and then tax credits and tax exempt bonds. And we started construction very recently, and we actually are in production in the factory as well with prototype units, and then starting to roll out the actual production of the full scale of all the rest of the units. So we're expecting construction completion in June of next year. Some of you might be asking, that doesn't seem like a super accelerated timeline, to which I'd answer it's not, but we're also trying not to be overly aggressive in our assumptions to start. It's something that, again, through the course of 5 projects, we're hoping to really hone in on and improve and make adjustments as needed. And by the time we get to our 3rd, 4th, 5th projects in the queue, we'll be able to actually see much better savings, both in timing and in cost. But even then, it still represents a few months of savings on our proposed construction schedule, which ultimately leads to people being housed faster, and also a slight reduction in some of the financing costs associated with the project. And this project did take advantage of the Revolving Construction Loan Fund, working closely with LISC, who helped kind of bring all of our partners together to administer the fund. And so it was roughly 1.3 million that we used here, and this again was during the pre-development period, and then was paid off at our construction loan closing by our construction lender, who was Chase. So I think that covers everything here. And so I'm going to hand it over to James at Chase, who has probably a lot of the answers to the questions you're thinking of now based on my presentation.
Well, thank you, Brandon. And Beacon there, that rendering is beautiful. So thank you for pushing forward impactful communities like it, and the boat communities as well. But James Wasugi, again, nice to have everyone here, and absolutely a pleasure to be here. On the screen here, I have questions that I'm often asked as a modular lender. So I'm going to go ahead and go over those kind of questions. So the first one, these deposits. Obviously, the big thing we constantly get is, when are these deposits due? How much are these deposits? So there's many options. There's all sorts of variables. It often gets negotiated between the developer, between the GC, between the modular manufacturer in a supply agreement. But there's many options, but fairly common is about 1/3 upfront, about 25% often, and then 1/3 after certain milestones, and then also 1/3 during unit installation. And the unique thing about these deposits is there's an escrow that's set up. It's not, the money is generally just not just funded. There's an escrow set up during construction where we fund to as a construction lender. So we follow our normal construction monthly timeline for funding construction loan proceeds, but we fund to a escrow because the modular providers need to be paid weekly. They need to be paid for the materials and everything that's going to be going towards building these units. They need to be paid weekly. So we fund to an escrow, and then this escrow releases these deposits according to what was agreed upon in the supply agreement. So now when will Chase start funding? When did we get comfortable funding? So we're comfortable funding as soon as we, like Brandon kind of mentioned, as soon as we close, as soon as we record, as soon as all the construction loan documents are done and everyone is authorized closing. We're comfortable funding, and then also during construction, and we're open to reimbursing for modular deposits at closing if that's what's needed. And really, we look at it. We've approved the budget. We've approved the modular manufacturer. The modules are part of the budget, so we look at it as like it's any other construction line item. So we should be able to be comfortable funding it. So what does it look like when a construction lender is able to fund at closing first waiting? That's a pretty simple one. It means there's no gap in someone that's able to provide that funding. It means, yes, the construction loan is a little bit larger because we're funding that those deposits, and we're funding at closing maybe for a reimbursable deposit, but we are funding that. So the construction loan may be a little larger, and our collateral is the land and the modules as they are produced. We are the senior lender on the closing. So what are a few challenges faced by modular projects when it comes to attracting conventional financing? Well, first, the modular companies are funded on a weekly basis, which we talked about. And then a lot of lenders might not be comfortable bridging these deposits that are needed for these modular manufacturers. And then modular companies get paid differently than other subs. They're being paid weekly, like we have discussed. And the number of modular companies to replace another modular provider, if for some reason something does happen to go wrong, is not a large pool. You have many GCs, but you don't have a large group of modular providers of which to then choose from. And you'd also have to find time to fit in their schedule. So the number of modular companies you'd be able to move from if for some reason you need to switch modular companies is limited. So how did we as a lender, how did Chase get comfortable funding when it does? Well, the biggest way we've got comfortable is there's the state. The state is responsible for constantly inspecting these units, constantly doing regularly checkups of these modules in California and making sure everything is going according to how it's supposed to go and meeting all the requirements of the state, and also making sure that the UCCs are tracked properly. So we know that the state is doing all their due diligence and making sure these are being done according to plan and how they're supposed to be done. And in addition, we have our own construction consultant that goes out, that did the planning cost review for us, that's doing the monthly inspections for us, that we get a report back that shows us exactly what's going on with the units, what's going on in the factory. They go to the factory and see what's going on and then provide us with an inspection. And then again, we've done our own due diligence on the modular provider. We've reviewed who they are. We've reviewed their pipeline, their financials, their liquidity, their capital raising goals if they're a newer modular manufacturer. We've really gotten comfortable with them, with the GC. And so we're comfortable lending to this group. So a few of the risks and how we're able to mitigate them. So we talked about the smaller pool of GCs. We talked about these large upfront deposits and the weekly payments that are being needed from them. But there's also, like we talked about, the pipeline. So you don't want to lose your place in the pipeline. There's always a chance that you could lose your place in pipeline, but you really want to make sure that you've secured your place in that pipeline. So, and that when the time comes, you're able to have those units starting as they're supposed to be, because the last thing you want to do is miss your place in the pipeline, because then you'll have to either switch manufacturers to start earlier with hopefully in a different pipeline, or find with that same modular manufacturer, either move your project later on in the pipeline, whenever that may be, or find gaps in the pipeline, if there even are any, to be able to get your modules built. So you really want to make sure that you're not losing your place in line, but that is definitely a risk. And how we've really mitigated it, besides what I just talked about with the state, with our inspector, with us doing all our due diligence on the modular provider. And really, when we're looking at a modular provider, we're looking at them just like we would any other GC as well. But we also look that we work with experienced developers, like we talked about Mercy, like we talked about Abode Communities. We look with experienced developers. They may be doing their first modular project, but experienced developers that have really developed multifamily affordable housing communities before. So if that's something did come up, they'd be able to switch to standard stick-built construction if needed. You really want that experience there. So if we can move to the next slide. and I'll go over. There we go. So if we could move to the next slide, we did move to the next slide. So if we could talk about now, we'll talk about what is the construction lender, what is Chase really looking for? The first one, who has the modular experience? Is it the developer? Is it the architect? Is it the GC? Is it all three, or is it just one of them? It doesn't matter how many of them have experience. It's great if they all do, but we need at least one party to really have that experience. If something goes wrong, you need a party that has dealt with issues on modular projects and knows how to solve them, knows how to work through them, and knows how to push the project forward. That's critical. So whether it's the developer, whether it's the architect, whether it's GC, you need at least one of those parties, and we want to see at least one of those parties has experience with modular. So what is the modular provider's experience? It's definitely something we're going to want to see, and that's okay if they might be a newer modular provider. But we're going to look at what have they built, who are their founders, what is their founders' experience. This is definitely something we're going to look at. Is a modular contract a subcontractor of the GC? That's going to be important to us as a lender. Our preference is that the modular contract definitely be a subcontract, because issues do arise, and if an issue does arise, you want there not to be any finger pointing. You want the one party that's going to be dealing with the subcontractor, that's going to be dealing with the modular manufacturer, to be the GC. That's important. So what does the modular factory's pipeline look like? They can provide you a detailed schedule of what's in their pipeline and when it's going to be on the factory floor getting built. We're going to want to take a look at that. We're going to want to know where this project fits in that schedule. It can be very hard to get back into the pipeline if you lose your spot. So again, that's critical. You don't want to have to fit your modules in a gap somewhere, or find a new modular provider if that comes to it. So where will these units be stored, and how will they be stored? That's definitely something you're going to want to pay attention to, and we're going to take a look at. We'll ask, where will they be stored once they come off the production line? Is it going to be at the modular manufacturer's facility, or is it going to be at a site that is maybe near the project, where they'll sit until they're ready to be actually put on the site? We're going to want to know where those modules are going to be are going to be or going to sit. And we'll want to make sure that that site where those modules are sitting have insurance, and also that they have security. You want to make sure that nothing is going to happen to those modules. So you want security. And if something does happen, occasionally things do happen, you want to make sure that there's insurance that can cover if anything does happen. And speaking of insurance, you want to make sure there's transportation insurance. Somehow these modules have to get to that site, and they have to be transported to that site. You want to make sure, and we're always going to make sure that there's satisfactory insurance for transportation. As they're sitting on the site, really across the board, we're going to make sure that we have adequate insurance. But the big thing about insurance, the big thing about storage, the big thing about security is you want to make sure that that doesn't eat away at your savings. The whole reason we're talking here is about saving money. Modulars, we want it to save money. We want it to hopefully be done faster. But if things aren't done correctly, if all the if everything isn't looked at up front in terms of security and insurance and storage, it can quickly eat away at those costs. And it's very important to make sure that all those costs are factored in when we get to closing. So how is the bonding being done? That's another thing. P&P bond. We often get asked, and how are we going to look at a P&P bond? So we don't typically require P&P bonds for subs, but we will want a P&P bond for amount of the GC contract. And having the modular provider as a subcontractor to the GC, will get a P&P bond for the amount of the GC contract. Occasionally, GC may exclude it, but we typically want to see it covered somehow. And then how does the modular provider's financials and liquidity look like, and how is capital raising going? That's a big one for us. We're going to look at everything kind of like we do at a normal GC. We're going to look at their experience. We're going to look at their financials very intricately. We're going to look at their liquidity. We're going to look at their capital raising in regards to how quickly they're going. We're going to pay very close attention to their financials. That's very important. So with that, I want to say modular is nothing new. It's been around for quite a long time. It's been going on in all areas of the world for quite a long time. It's not nothing that's new. What's new is the variations of it now and how it's being done. We have construction folks that are well-versed and comfortable with it. And we recognize that it needs to be treated like any other reimbursables. We need all options on the table when it comes to finding ways to support affordable housing communities and innovative efforts. So that's why we're so committed to doing modular housing and supporting communities like Brandon's community that he talked about. So I'm going to pass it over to Chris. I'd love to hear about the Hilton Foundation's efforts here.
Thank you. So there's actually 3 philanthropic partners that invested in the fund: California Community Foundation, Common Spirit Health, and Conrad and Hilton Foundation. I can't talk for all 3, but I'm probably here today because I used to work at one of the foundations, one of the other ones, California Community Foundation, and now I'm at another one, Hilton Foundation. So at least I can give a little bit of perspective, but today I'll mainly focus on the perspective of Hilton Foundation, how we looked at it. So for a little bit of background, I would say the Hilton Foundation for the past 10 years has invested in loan funds that finance acquisition and pre-development with both national and local CDFIs. So, funding for supportive housing production is nothing new. But the majority of those projects are kind of traditional construction deals, still low-income housing tax credit deals. And as we saw development costs steadily rise, at the same time housing needs have increased. Over the past 3 to 4 years, I would say we've been looking at what are different ways to build units faster and possibly reduce costs. So there's different things we've invested in, like motel and hotel conversions or private financing models, even just working with landlords to rent out existing units. But this modular loan fund is really interesting and exciting. And so I think sometimes foundations can help with things that look risky, like it says there, and maybe we can fund to bridge a gap that might be kind of small. And what I'm looking for in those is usually which ones of these can maintain quality of the units developed. We'll just read some of these pilots that can track what worked well and what didn't work well. Groups that are willing to share the lessons learned with the broader development community. And the ultimate goal would be to find things that are actually scalable, if possible. So there's lots of developers and I see a lot of developers as problem solvers, and several groups have innovative ideas. They're testing new ways to finance, reduce reliance on certain sources of financing. But it's like when we can find a group that's working together collaboratively on this, it's really interesting. So if we go to the next slide, I'll kind of talk about how I looked at this specific group of projects. So I said there were these 4 things. The quality, it was really great to find a team of 3 strong, experienced developers all working together. And basically they already have experience in development and management of supportive housing units, and collectively have done thousands of units, right? So, and I got to see when they were designing this, that they were working with the resident services team to really try to make sure that the units would work well for the clients we're trying to serve. And then in tracking what worked, I saw a lot of individual projects that people were working on, but this was really nice because it was 5 projects, a collective group, totaling almost 400 units. And we're trying to find out and track, is this going to be faster over time? Is this going to be less expensive? And, I thought it was really nice that it is traditional government financing, but a different construction method. So it actually might be really interesting to compare a group of projects that got the same types of financing, but different construction method. And then in sharing lessons learned, there's been so much collaboration between the partners on site identification and the standard design templates, how the financing model is working, and even as we go forward, it'll be on like delivery and assembly, and then scalable, and can it be replicable if successful, right? So I thought this was also interesting because these partners might be able to do more modular deals if they find this to work well. And if successful, LISC helped create this loan fund, which we'll talk about, but maybe it could be available to, right now it's kind of a closed fund for this specific projects, but if it's successful, maybe it could be opened up a little bit further and see if there's demand for it from others. So if we go to the next slide, I think the other considerations that really made this go well were the investment amount, right? Originally, it was 20 million that was needed from outside of the banking industry. And I just, with Chase's willingness to come in earlier and than we thought was possible, was really amazing, and it bridged that gap so that there was only a $6 million amount that was needed on these projects, which was much more doable for philanthropic dollars to come in and kind of fill that smaller gap. And then from a foundation perspective, like for me, we don't do as much direct lending here. So trying to support 5 different projects would be a lot tougher. But supporting LISC to manage a loan fund to support the projects worked out really well. And it enabled, I feel like, all of us, to the foundation partners, to work together on all 5 of these projects, rather than just being able to maybe fund 1 or 2. And I will pass it back to Alex.
Well, Chris, I mean, you made a good comment about the knowledge sharing. We agree. I mean, the knowledge sharing is critical. Being able to assess a site for modular is critical, and being able to share that between developers is really that's an essential thing. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, James and Brendan, for sharing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the fund that folks have alluded to so far in their presentations, and why LISC was involved, and why we were interested in working with the collaborative. And I'll go through this very briefly, but as you all probably know, LISC is a community development financial institution, and we have a national presence, but have been in Los Angeles since 1988. And over those past, over 30 years, have invested close to $900 million and leveraged somewhere around $3 billion in affordable housing and commercial and community development projects. And LISC is not only a lender focusing on early stage pre-development acquisition lending, but we're also an investor, a capacity builder, a convener, and an innovator. So we try to bring multiple tools to the table aside from just finance, to bring innovation to our field and to move project concepts from A to Z. And we do that by pooling public and private dollars. We work with, through our local partners and in close relationship with our local partners who are really doing the day-to-day work on the ground to support people and places. So LISC had the privilege of being approached by Brendan and his colleagues from LA Family Housing and Mercy Housing, who did all the legwork just about to kind of come up with this concept. They did the legwork to figure out, what is the solution that we need here, and kind of backed into the relationship from there. But they came to us with this concept that they needed a revolving fund to finance these 25% deposits that we've been talking about. The idea was to establish a revolving fund that would finance the 25% deposits on these 398 units of permanent supportive housing, with the overarching goal of establishing a proof of concept that the fund could promote the use of efficient modular construction, reduce development costs, reduce delivery timelines, and ultimately reduce homelessness in LA County. And so when LISC was approached, we look at fund design as building something from the ground up. So we combined, the vision and the local knowledge of our partners with the financial and market acumen of LISC, and essentially built a product together that was going to be useful and targeted for the challenge that lay ahead for these developers. So we really look at housing funds as being able to serve the unmet needs of a local community, of a market, and of funders through collective impact. So, if there were something out there already that existed that was solving this gap, we may not have needed to develop this pilot fund, but Brendan and his collaborators brought together both the concept and the investments from philanthropy. And so we were able to take that and combine with LISC capital to make this fund. So let's see, and I have to give credit to Matt Lieber. I know Matt is listening in, but Matt is on our national LISC housing team, who was really the brains behind this fund design. So why a fund? We're kind of using the term fund loosely here. For those of you who have been involved in fund management and design, sometimes it is a very kind of taxing legal and drawn out process to create a fund. In this scenario, I would call it more of a faux fund, where we're not establishing an entirely different legal structure to hold this money, but we are able to do this kind of on balance sheet for LISC. But really the goal here again was to create a fund to support something that doesn't currently exist in the market or doesn't fit the conventional financing toolbox. The fund and support from PRI investments from foundations can really help us stretch our credit box and do something that's a little bit more innovative. And again, a well-designed fund is very, very narrowly focused to serve a definable problem. And we clearly had a definable problem that the collaborative brought to us. And again, a fund can have the most impact when it takes a cross-sector approach. So in this scenario, we brought together developers, philanthropy, CDFI, and our construction banking partners to come up with a solution. So the fund itself is estimated to be about a $7.9 million revolving pilot fund. We'll see where that number ends up based on shifting construction costs. But really it was designed to demonstrate the speed and scalability of modular. We're deploying low interest, low cost capital to developers as bridge financing. So LISC is serving as the fund manager. We're underwriting the 5 loans that are coming through from the 3 developers, managing the loans, bringing them through our credit committee and getting approval and closing on the financing. Our foundation partners are bringing PRI investments through low interest loan capital that is flexible and can help kind of mitigate the risk, I suppose, with the loans that we're doing here. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the developer collaborative, of course, is bringing the deals, and Factory OS has also been a crucial partner in this, in that they are partnering with the developers collaborative to develop each of these 5 projects. I want to mention again, and Chris mentioned this, that there are 3 philanthropic funders here, Conrad and Hilton Foundation, California Community Foundation, and Common Spirit Health. Getting into the weeds a little bit about how each loan is funded, LISC is committed to funding 25% of each of these bridge loans, which can range from about $1.2 to $2 million or so. And the foundations are supporting 75% of each of those loans. So the foundation capital really helped sort of mitigate LISC's risk on these deals, primarily because these are unsecured loans, which were essential, of course, for the developers to access, because developers often take out either pre-development or acquisition financing, and there's really nothing left to leverage or use collateral for to secure an additional loan in that pre-development stage. So having this flexible PRI capital was crucial to getting these loans out. Each loan has an interest rate that has been reduced because of the PRI investments. And then the loans have limited recourse. So these have served to be as flexible as possible given the stage of the project. So let me jump into the funds revolve. So as I mentioned, we think we're going to revolve about $7.9 million to fund 25% of the modular deposits for these 5 projects. As you can see here, we have a general range of how much each of these deposits will be and when they might go out. some of the risks that LISC looked at when funding these pre-development kind of slash bridge loans. And as James talked about, we're paying attention to the modular developer, right? So we know that kind of the modular construction has sort of had this wave of successes and you know, more tests, right? And so we want to make sure that the fabricators and the modular factories have a great history, have a strong balance sheet, and we kind of understand their process. Sometimes with permitting, local jurisdictions may not be as familiar with modular construction. I think one thing that was great that came out of the work that the collaborative was doing, or may not have necessarily come out of, but kind of coincided with, but the city of Los Angeles, as major departments came together in 2020 to sign a factory built housing MOU, where they outlined a joint partnership among the city agencies to improve processes related to approvals of factory built housing in the city. So this, from an underwriting and lending perspective, helped with, you know, getting our credit committee comfortable with the question of, you know, are they going to get permitted? Is the project going to get entitled, right? One of the major underwriting kind of hurdles or aspects that we looked at was the security and the collateral on these loans. So as I mentioned, these bridge loans are largely going to be unsecured. The mitigant that we saw here, and that was really helpful for us, was that before our bridge loan goes out to supply the factory with the 25% deposit, the borrower has already secured 100% of their financing commitment. So Brendan and his team and the rest of the developers have already gone through, they have their HHH award, they have all their soft financing, they've applied and received their tax credit awards. So knowing that the projects are already at this late stage, they're a few months before construction closing, really got us comfortable in knowing, of course, the developer's experience to bring a project from a tax credit award to construction closing, got us comfortable with providing that unsecured loan. Again, the philanthropic PRIs provided top loss. And then I highlighted here that the LISC bridge loan is going to be reimbursed at construction closing. So this was a big question that I got from multiple construction lenders that I talked to, which was, are you sure that your loan is going to be reimbursed at construction closing? Because a lot of lenders have not yet gotten to the stage where they're comfortable with that, with, as James was explaining, with getting to a point where they're saying this is like any other line item and I'm comfortable with funding this at construction closing. So understanding that this bridge loan really was going to be short term, LISC was not going to be in the deal after construction closing and waiting, you know, for a repayment and potentially, you know, 10th in line below all the other lenders, really got us to a place where we could get comfortable with making these loans. So I wanted to highlight some of the long-term impacts that I know folks have already touched upon, but we're in the same kind of headspace as the rest of the funders and the lenders here, that we really want to take what we're doing here with this pilot program and make it available to a wider audience in terms of the lessons learned, and, you know, potentially, if it is successful, scale something like this, and or, you know, challenge construction lenders or other lenders to do more to get comfortable with funding these really early stage, or not really early stage, but earlier than construction closing stage deposits, right? And proving that this model or financing these deposits really isn't as risky as we might think it is. We want to create an open source template for future modular projects, potentially become a replicable model for not only our Los Angeles LISC partners, but across the country. Institutionalized modular housing is a key strategy in solving our homelessness crisis and our affordable housing crisis, and really increase modular builder and modular developer capacity in Southern California and across the state. So that is the end of our slides. I do have some questions for the panelists, and I'm not sure if we can, Mike, from a tech standpoint, highlight everybody, all the panelists, so we can get a conversation going. I know that there's some questions in the chat. So I'm going to jump in with a couple of questions, and folks in the audience, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat or raise your hand. I think you could probably ask live, and maybe I'll aim that question to Mike. Can folks ask questions live here? And if not, just type them in the chat and I will read them out. So my first question is potentially for all of you. So, whoever wants to take it can. Where do you see major kind of changes in the financing landscape still needed for modular housing? And what might make modular even more accessible from a financing standpoint for folks that are kind of just exploring it?
Sure. Well, I can start as a developer, but I think obviously, while it's been great to have certain select partners who are willing to come in early and earlier to finance this, the more options and the more competition that is available, obviously, the better for us as developers. And so I think that's something that we are trying to help prove out here as well, is just by doing more of this work and showing that it can succeed and that the risk is well worth it. More and more folks will be interested in providing financing up front, and that can include, our public financing partners and their willingness to fund this work even when it's not quite yet on site. I think that'll just help the technology proliferate that much faster. So that's a little bit of an obvious answer, but I think it's still worth discussing.
And I think Brandon hit the nail on the head. I mean, it takes everyone. It doesn't take just any one party. It takes everyone. So the more folks that can get comfortable with modular housing, the more folks that can have experience in this type of work, with lenders sharing their knowledge, developers sharing their knowledge, the more folks that are getting comfortable with knowledge, the more folks that are invested in this and know about this, the better. So, I mean, it really takes everyone.
Thanks. So this question's for Brendan. So as we talked about, we're still kind of in the very early stages of this pilot program, right? You've got one project that is now under construction. Within the fund, we have another project that's just about to close on their modular deposit financing, and then we'll close construction in a few months from now. Are there early takeaways that you can or recommendations that you can make to audience members who might be in the early stages of planning a modular project, something that they can do, or should start looking at right away as it relates to financing modular?
Yeah, again, it's a little bit of an obvious answer, but then again, nothing new under the sun. I mean, I think all these things take a lot of time. And so I think about the amount of time that we've been talking about this fund and the amount of time it took us to pull together the partners, make sure they were getting their approvals, making sure we were getting our approvals, making sure we were asking for the right thing. And then even from the time that we started talking to LISC, we all have major deadlines, especially once you start getting some of your other key funding awards, namely TCAC and SIDLAC. So you really want to have your ducks in a row before those milestones are upon you, as much as possible, at least. And so just recognizing that with something new, you want to provide yourself as much time as possible to work through some of those challenges. And that extends, beyond the financing as well, whether it's your contractor partners or the factory themselves. You just need to try to make sure you're providing yourself as much time as possible to have those conversations, work through any potential surprises, and get to a place and to a product that works for everybody.
For James, I was curious if you can talk a little bit more about sort of the progression for Chase of getting comfortable with funding the modular deposits earlier. As I think you talked about, and I talked about a little bit, some of the construction lenders that I've talked to in the past are aren't quite there yet. So I'm curious if you can share how Chase got to a point where this became less and less of an issue.
Mhm. Well, I think our big thing is knowing that it's not anything new. Modular's been done for a long time. We have experienced folks at Chase that have dealt with modular, experienced construction folks that have well versed in modular, that really know about it. And then we look at it as a budget line item. We do our due diligence prior to closing to see that that's in the budget, to make sure all the costs, contingency, everything is there, so that it really is being looked at like it's any other line item. And then having that state backstop, that's having that state there that's really doing the due diligence weekly, making sure those UCCs are filed like they're supposed to be, appropriately filed. That is critical to the process. All those kind of factors together really allows us to kind of look at these like it's a line item in the budget, and when we get to closing, we can fund it like we would a normal kind of construction project.
I have a question for Chris. In exploring this concept, when you started initially thinking about providing support to this type of fund, was there a level of education, I guess, or a level of trying to understand the modular development process that you had to go through yourself, or bring your teammates and your board up to speed on to get them comfortable with this type of investment?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think it was more than just modular, I think, because there's a lot of ideas, reused shipping containers, new shipping containers, modular, full modular, partial modular, like kits parts. So I think it was more exploring that there are a lot of different ideas people are testing, and determining which ones we can actually look at, which ones have already been done. This one, I'd say the financing aspect and when money comes in and goes out, and how modular manufacturers create, have to buy the materials, then put it in, get it into the timeline, the production timeline, and then move them over, delivery and assembly. Like, I think it's all kind of intriguing and interesting that it's different than the way the normal process works. But I would say from our end, it was more, we probably had to do a lot more of that internally for myself. And then for leadership, I'd say it was easier to look at this one due to the kind of expertise of all the partners involved, knowing that they had done other deals in the past, kind of something similar that James had said. So it wasn't their first time, doing these projects. It's a new method, but some of the other partners on the deal, I know, were testing modular deals, as well. So we were just looking for people who could actually get through the problems that will definitely probably come up in any construction project or any development. Like, do we have the right team that can problem solve and, come together and put it, I'm not usually, that's not my role in the deals, but making sure that there's somebody on the team that's really smart and like used to kind of doing this on other deals. So that made it a lot easier to kind of look at it and say, we can move this forward because we know these partners know what they're doing. They can make it happen. And then not just the process of it, but knowing that there's going to be some ability for all three of the partners and multiple deals to kind of learn from each one and kind of hopefully, share those learnings. Or there might be different things that come up on each project, but there might be the same thing that came up on the first one that you can adapt for before the third one happens. And so it's really interesting. I think we're still in the process, and we'll see. Brendan will be able to say a lot more about what's what problems have come up and how they've resolved them. But that was the main thing, just the expertise of the partners involved.
Thanks, Chris. So folks, I'm going to turn questions over to the audience. So if you have a question, you should be able to raise your hand and we'll take you off mute to ask the question, or alternatively, you can add your question to the Q&A. But I have one here, and the question is for Brendan. So from what this person has heard, sometimes factories are not bondable as startups. Can you talk about how Abode handled potentially looking at PMP bonds, whether or not a factory that you've worked with has been able to be bonded? How did you get comfortable without a bond, or how were you able to absorb that risk?
Sure, yeah, and I think James even kind of referenced this in his presentation that, obviously the contractor we're working with providing a payment performance bond, that's something that's very key to us. But then ultimately it becomes a very intense risk management conversation that involves us as the developer, but also the contractor and then the factory, because the factory is ultimately a subcontractor of the GC. And so in some ways, it's kind of a bit of a forced relationship that we are bringing to the GC because we've been working with this particular factory since the beginning. But it's something that through many months of conversation and back and forth, and not always the most pleasant, but a lot of intense risk management discussion. I believe in this case, there was a specific insurance product that was provided from the factory that brought comfort to the contractor and then us as well. But again, the way that risk gets passed around, it's just kind of an ongoing back and forth conversation. So again, it may be simple or overly simplistic advice, but just recognizing that these things take time. It's a great question, a good thing to recognize up front and begin those conversations as early as you can.
Yeah, I think time, and I'll add to that, I think time is definitely key. And I think working with the GC that's dealt with it before, I mean, they'll dealt with factories that might not be bondable or might be bondable. Working with the GC that's experienced in those type of negotiations would also add to it. I'm sure, I don't know the GC that's working on your project, Brendan, but I'm sure they have experience, maybe probably with modular prior to the Beacon project you mentioned. So that's probably another key there too.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's see. All right, so I see Matthew Haas has his hand up. Matthew, do you want to ask a question? Okay, maybe not. Let's see.
Are we able to unmute folks, Alex, or is that
I
something
think
that
so. I think if you open up the participants.
Yes, I can definitely unmute them.
Oh,
If
thanks,
that's,
Matt.
yeah, so
Hey, it's Matthew, sorry.
There you are. Hi.
Hi. So I had two specific questions. One was, have those of the people in the modular space started to look at working with CDFIs and creating an opportunity to establish regional factory-built modular hubs? CDFIs have the ability to do new market tax credits. They have the ability to help promulgate regional factory-built housing, and they can do it in partnership from strategic trades, working with community colleges and rural, colleges as a way to create volume and capacity across California's northern, central, and southern California and coast.
Alex, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but
Yeah, so I can speak to LISC LA's experience. We haven't had those conversations with factories, but you're right, Matthew, that the resources are potentially out there with the new market tax credits. I know that factories have explored coming to Southern California, but I can't speak to the specific challenges that they've had. I think it's more related to land and space. Maybe others on the panel can talk a little bit more about that, or if they've had any conversations with those factories.
yeah, and I can't speak on behalf of Factory OS, but I know that in some of our earliest conversations with them, they were pretty actively looking in Southern California. Some of that was prior to the pandemic, and so I'm not sure how that might have changed their calculus, but I think, like Alex said, yeah, definitely the land and space challenge, but I think also, just kind of the chicken or egg nature of kind of their work and making sure that there is sufficient demand to justify them placing a factory where they want to. But then again, until there's a factory, people might not be interested in pursuing that technology. So I know it's an ongoing conversation and a good question that honestly we should be following up with them to just kind of, I think, encourage more supply at local levels.
Okay, so there's another question in the chat. So this person says, I had heard that there are challenges with aligning all of the tight timeline restrictions of other sources of funding, such as tax credits and modular projects. Is that the case? And if so, can you speak to how you're thinking about other systems changes needed to finance these projects at scale?
I don't think, I'm trying to kind of run through what those challenges might be. And at least from my experience, I don't think it necessarily, maybe when you're talking about like a 9% deal where there are a lot more restrictive back-end requirements about completion. I think we, collectively decided let's stick to the 4% model. It's a little bit more forgiving. And so I think that's something that maybe is being referenced at here. But in terms of kind of the pre-development period leading up to starting construction, I don't think there were any other like financing program challenges that were, made worse by the prospect of using modular. But obviously, if I think of something, I can chime in further.
James, have you run into that at all?
I can't think I could say that much from a lender. So I think the biggest challenge would be aligning up trying to get if you're applying for bonds or applying for tax credits, hoping that you get tax credits, hoping that you get bonds. So with the lack of availability for bonds for everyone, and then trying to time that up with you getting in line for your modules to be produced. I think trying to align that is probably one of the most challenging things. I don't know if you agree there, Brandon, but
yeah, no, that's definitely a good point. And I think it was something that we talked about a lot with the factory early on, was we are not going to be really willing or able to put down that first deposit until we have a commitment of bonds and credits. And so I think that was a little bit unusual from kind of how they typically approached it. But ultimately they kind of understood that that was a key financing milestone for us and we wouldn't be able to do it otherwise. And so, yeah, certainly if you're needing to get, and hold a place in a factory line before you have those commitments, then you might be stretching out your financing commitments longer and longer if you miss around or whatever happens. So I think trying to work with the factory to have them align as much as possible with the financing schedule, that can help things out in the long run.
I don't see any hands up or questions in the chat right now, so I can go back to some of my questions. But just sort of thinking about the question that Matthew asked, and then this last question, I've been hearing about like delays on the production line with some factories occurring right now, just as there are with other construction delays and procuring material delays. How do you, is the way that you mitigate for that risk the same as the way you would for a traditional stick build, or is it different?
I think it's a little bit different in that, and maybe this will partially answer your question, but I think one of the things we were faced with early on was the module production. Once they get up and running, it's supposed to be pretty lightning quick, right? They're rolling quite a number of modules off the line per day, per week. And so at least for our Beacon Landing project, where we have a considerable amount of site work that we need to do. Those timelines, you're generally trying to stack those up, and those aren't evenly spaced timelines. Like our site work is going to take a lot longer than our modules are going to take to build. That might not be the case in every project, but that's what it was here. And so we were faced with the choice of, oh, we can try to kind of wait until the end of our site work period and then sort of just in time it, right? And have the production start like exactly the amount of time before we need to deliver them to site, and then everything kind of lines up perfectly smoothly. That's the ideal example, but the big risk is that if there's any delay in the production, then you're just sitting around with a stalled out site waiting for units to arrive. We obviously want to avoid that. So the flip side is starting production basically as soon as you start construction and close on your construction financing. The challenge there that I think James brought up is then you've got a longer storage period, and there's a long time where the units have been rolled off the line, they're out of the factory, and they're in storage. And so you just need to make sure that the way they're being stored maintains their quality and they're safe and secure. And so you have quite a long time that we're then waiting. But at least if there are delays in the production schedule, that's okay with you. You know, it's not eating into your schedule in any other way. And you've kind of already built in a way to absorb that. So I think that's how we addressed it on this particular project.
Yeah, and that definitely gets into making sure you have that storage costs adequately anticipated in your budget, because then that's definitely where you can get into seeing your cost savings get eaten away if for some reason you need to store your units and that wasn't planned, or longer than that was planned. That's the last thing you want to do, because you're trying to save costs here and trying to save time. So,
right.
Okay, so given where we are with this pilot program, right? We're still very early stage, but as we've been talking about, modular is not new. The industry has been doing this for a while. In your opinions, where do you think we are in terms of, understanding whether or not, or do we have the data available to say like, yes, modular housing should be scaled, and we have the data to show that it's effective and cost effective and efficient, or we're not there yet. Are we there yet? And if not, what additional resources I don't even know who, can the state, can the cities, can CDFIs provide to incentivize continuing to explore this or making modular more accessible? I know it's a big question.
well, I think a lot of it is sharing knowledge. Like developers, is this a good site that would possibly be a good site for modular? Because the last thing you want to do is build on a site that's not going to be a good site for modular. But I think so. A lot of it is sharing knowledge. I think, Brandon, I thought you were going to say something. I don't know if you're going to add something, but I mean, I think a lot of it is sharing knowledge. I don't know if it's understood yet, if it's really there's an answer to that question yet, but it really comes down to how the process goes. It can save time, it can save money, but it all depends on how the process goes. Is like we just talked about with the storage, or if you don't have these things eating away at costs, you could definitely see savings. But if you don't have these things anticipated in the budget and they do come up, it could quickly eat away at your storage. Quickly eat away at your savings, quickly eat away at your time. And then it's just as much as a stick-built project.
Yeah, no, I think the short answer is no, we don't have that data yet, or at least I don't feel like we do. And part of that is just acquiring more data to kind of see where there have been successes and where there have been even more challenges. And some of it gets to what Chris was talking about earlier, with there are also, modular is not this monolithic thing. There are a lot of different modular approaches and typologies, and even just kind of like modular parts, in buildings that you can kind of install bathrooms or panels or that sort of thing. And so I think it's going to take a lot more attempts to really get at what works, what doesn't, and what's the most effective. But I think there's also, it'll also just be interesting to see what other benefits that maybe weren't presumed up front that are associated with it as well, such as kind of the controlled factory environment where this construction is happening, and what that means for the workers themselves, and what it means for your environmental sustainability goals. I think there's just a lot of other components to it that we can point to as well. So I think we're still a ways, but that was part of what our initiative was let's not do this as a one-off. Let's try it through a course of projects. Not going to say we'll have it figured out by the end of that, but maybe we'll be a little bit closer.
And I'll chime in too. I'd say, I don't know, from my perspective, like the way I saw it was, modular has been around a while, but not everybody's used it, and not everybody's financed it or been on these projects. So anytime you're starting something new, it can actually take longer, right, in the startup phase. And it's also, I feel like it's the frequency or the scale of something. So like when I start a new project and I'm doing it once a week, it's really easy to find out what's wrong with it and improve the process. If I'm doing something that I only do once every 6 months, it takes me a lot longer to find how to improve that process. So I think as more people do this and share learnings, it'd be really interesting to see, is this a lot faster? When was it really fast? What are the problems that can be avoided in the future and thought of in advance? And, in terms of the cost savings, that would be really interesting to see in the future too. It's hard as costs keep rising to measure like old projects versus new projects, but that's probably the same in traditional construction as well. But yeah, it's an exciting thing. I think one of the things that was really interesting, I forgot to mention, is I know people from California Community Foundation, and I myself, like from here, went on a couple site visits to modular manufacturers. So that was really helpful in understanding the process and seeing how it works. So I kind of was helpful in that initial phase of how does this all work, and along with some of those examples of when the financing kicks in and when deposits are needed.
So thank you. We have another question. So the question is, my understanding is the factory would not start production until the project has approved plans. For the 25% deposit, does this assume that the plans are approved by the state prior to construction closing? If you have a complex site or podium project that needs time to complete before the modular units can be set, can you contract with the factory at closing so the modular units are fabricated at the same time as your site work is done? I think Brendan, talked about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is and there's a couple of good questions in there, but to start with the latter one, yeah, I think definitely where you can, a lot of the assumed cost savings and time savings in modular is the ability to build the units at the same time that you're building the podium, because not everything has to happen in direct sequence like it does in a conventionally built project. So yeah, I think you definitely want to try to achieve that as part of your program when you're going about modular. The first question I think was more about the timing of the upfront deposits in relation to approved plans. And I also should clarify that everything I presented was pretty specific to our experience with Factory OS, but other factories are going to approach this differently, and percentages may vary and the timing might vary a little bit. I would assume it's somewhat similar, but I know maybe even Factory OS might be changing that approach as they grow and they learn from what they're doing. But in our case, there was essentially one smaller deposit, like roughly 5% of the cost. That was what we put down at the time of our TCAC award. And that was really just kind of like good faith. Let's hold our place on the line, give you some commitment, some skin in the game. And then later, as we got close to the start of production, when they actually needed to start procuring materials, and we actually had approved plans from the state at that point, we put in a much larger 20% chunk of the deposit. So yeah, I think it's, again, it's all up for discussion, I think, and trying to negotiate that with whatever factory you're working with, but also understanding what their needs are and kind of what their required timing is.
Thanks. So, and Another question, can panelists share some go, no-go discussions they had regarding potential modular projects?
I don't want to do all the talking, but I think some of these might be geared my way. So James and Chris, feel free to jump in. But I think from our perspective, for this initiative, this was obviously a commitment, an upfront focus. And so we kind of started with the directive of go. But I know we've been looking elsewhere in our portfolio and our pipeline at potentially using modular and seeing where it makes sense. And I think sometimes where it really hasn't penciled out or made sense is where you have a greater variety of unit types, where, kind of replicating the same unit over and over is not as desirable or possible for whatever reason. And so if you have a range of unit types from studios to 3 bedrooms, and maybe you've got some funky site condition that requires a specific corner unit or multiple units that have to be kind of one-off, then really just modular isn't going to work out. And so I know we've kind of seen that happen, even though we brought it up to a factory partner and said, hey, can you take a look at this? Kind of go back and forth a couple of times and be like, this really isn't what this product type is meant for, at least quite yet. So that's kind of my experience. I'm sure a lot of other developers have had similar conversations, but certainly if you're just doing all studios like we're trying to do here, we can literally just take the same studio, replicate it not only in our project, but then in our partners' projects, over and over up to 400 times, with slight modifications as needed. Then it really, I think, begins to make sense as a way to pursue it.
Yeah, I think, oh, go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just gonna, I mean, obviously I'm not looking at individual deals and determining what type of construction could go, but I would say, looking at, I mentioned a lot about the expertise of the developers, but it's also the experience of the manufacturer too. So if somebody, at least from my end, like if somebody came with a brand new manufacturer, that would be really tough to get on board with that. Or sometimes it's coming from a really long way. If the manufacturer had expertise and the shipping makes sense and it's been done for a while, that's fine. But this one just happened to be in the same state where the projects are, which was a plus. So.
Yeah, and I can't obviously get into project specifics, but I mean, I think Brandon hit the nail on the head there with the examples he gave. And I mean, really, you want to make sure your project is adequately insured. You want to make sure, I mean, that's a big one. So if something does happen, you have the insurance in place that can cover that. You have a developer that knows how to work through challenges, or a GC that knows how to work through challenges, or an architect. So I think as you have those things in place, you have those mitigants to hopefully work through any of those challenges that you might see on a project, and ultimately get the project to where it needs to be.
Thank you. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, and I know we're can't believe we've made it already to 12:10, but I want to give you each an opportunity to share any last thoughts that you might have, and then we can close out for the day.
I'll go first.
Go for it.
Go ahead, Brent. Okay. I just want to say thank you all for joining this panel today. I mean, the fact that you're here, the fact that you're thinking about modular, the fact that you're putting forth efforts towards innovative communities, that's important. And that's important that we're here working together and we're here sharing our information. And at Chase, we're committed to those efforts. We're committed to developers that are designing modular communities or other types of innovative efforts. That's such important to meeting the needs of the affordable housing crisis. So thank you. And to my partners here as well, to Chris as well, and Alexandra, for putting together the funds like this that are so critical to being able to allow modular to be possible. Obviously, as a lender and a regulated institution, we can't step in prior to closing. So thank you to you both as well.
Yeah, I think that sums it up about as well as you can. The way I always look at it is like, I don't know if we're going to be the ones that necessarily figure this out. I hope we can figure out part of it, but really the hope is that collectively throughout all of our efforts, trying different approaches here and there, we're going to start uncovering some different construction technologies that allow us to take on this cost issue. And so we are very willing to share all the lessons learned that we have and all the trials and tribulations we go through. And we just hope that the rest of you are willing to do so in kind, and eventually we'll get to the bottom of this. So thanks to everybody for being here. And again, to Alex for setting this up, and the panelists for having a good conversation.
Yeah, likewise, I just wanted to say, at the front of the meeting, it seemed like a lot of attendees had done a lot of modular before. So I know we didn't have time to, get insight from the audience and their deals, but it's just, as we think about what the lessons learned are, how to build this, it's just really interesting. I hope there's ways to get broader information from all of you attendees that have experienced this as well. And maybe there's opportunities in the future to do some kind of information gathering and reports on how that's gone more collectively than just these projects. But I'm really excited to be working with these partners. And Alex, just thanks for pulling this together and helping us make it easy for each of the partners to get involved in the deal.
Yeah, thank you to everybody. LISC is beyond excited to be part of this, and hoping that we can lend our expertise to make one thing just a little bit easier for the developers. That we know you're applying for so many things and getting so much, jumping through so many hoops to get financing. So we hope that can make one thing easier for you. Thank you all so much for being here, and thanks to the audience for sticking around with us at the end of the conference. We hope you got some good takeaways, and as always, would love to hear your feedback. And we're looking forward to sharing our learnings as we move through this process with the collaborative. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful afternoon, and I hope to see you all soon.